Welcome to another edition of Cal's Corner Radio here on the X Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. The executive producer of the show is the one and only Rob McConnell. Now, folks, as you know, I say it at the top of every show, the purpose of Cal's Corner is to cover everything from politics to the paranormal. It's a wide variety of subjects. We don't get to all of them in one show. In fact, you couldn't cover them in a lifetime, but we hopefully contribute our little part. Now, we have tonight a special guest. His name is Art Levine. He's a famed investigative journalist. We'll come back to that in a moment. Before we continue, I want to take a couple of moments here just to give a few brief updates that are relevant to future shows going forward, and also to share some news with you. I found out around 5 this morning while I was getting ready to put some books to bed, stuff I'll talk about later, that a former teacher of mine, Ronald Carlson, has passed away. He just turned 80 years old. I want to send my condolences and love and best wishes to him and his family and loved ones. I'd like to thank a fellow classmate, Tammy Coavisto, for reconnecting us because I didn't know he was still alive. And on a personal note, when my 200 plus UFO report that I'd written and typed for him in 8th grade all those years ago that led to solving the Hill case, which is relevant to the ufology book series. When I wrote that report, typed it up, it was the first of a couple 100-page reports I would hit my teachers with. And I'll let the words speak for themselves, but he was blown away by it, and he thought I was going to turn it into a book and stuff. And we reconnected on Facebook several months ago. And as I will share with the world now, because I feel that it's especially timely, one of the last things he said to me, and I've got it in writing, folks, I'm not putting any famous last words in here, and I'd never do that. He said, "I'm glad you're getting these bastards." That's practically a quote. And what he's talking about is the upcoming series of exposés. Rob and I have been working on some stuff I've been working on with other authors, but sadly, Mr. Carlson has passed away, and I will sorely miss him, but I'm grateful to God that we were able to reconnect. It was as if we never skipped a beat. I have nothing but fond memories of him, and I am so grateful for having a handful of teachers who took me under their wing and, were more than second fathers to me after my own father abandoned us kids. So anyway, I'm sad over his loss, and I found out about that and went to bed with that thought, and just wanted to share that with you because I do that on the show. All right, switching subjects here real quickly. I don't know the date yet, and it will be a little bit before we do know the date, but one last note. The Annie Jacobson book will launch soon. I will be a guest, my understanding is, with Rob on his show, and I'll wait for Rob to set the date, but the books are due to arrive to Rob and I to do the final sign-off on them, along with the other Volume 2 series. I checked the Amazon system last night, and it says 3 days, so we'll see. Then once I have the date, I'll share that with you. I look forward to being a guest on Rob's show. It's always an honor. All right, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest for tonight. This show is essentially his for the rest of it. I will interject as I need to, because there's a lot of information that this individual can share with you on more than one topic. I've known him since the 1990s when I had the honor of meeting him. He contacted me when he was doing a series of very major pieces on the Roswell UFO crash myth of 1947. And what happened is this was in 1997, and he was doing some pieces for MSNBC. And they were doing some good investigative journalism. This gentleman is a top investigative journalist. And I say this because it's the truth. I'm not blowing sunshine. I don't do that. Anyway, without any further ado, from Washington, D.C. is Art Levine. And Art, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Cal. It's an honor to talk to you, and you're so knowledgeable on so many issues, so we share a certain eclecticism in our interests.
Well, yeah, and I'm honored to have gotten to know you years ago because I'll never forget when you called me when I was writing putting the finishing touches on the Roswell UFO crash, what they don't want you to know. And you had done a simple check on Frank Kaufman, and you asked me a very valid question: why couldn't Kevin Randall and others find this one? And you did in what, one phone call?
Right. He didn't have the military service he claimed.
Yeah.
And then secondly, when I got him on the phone, he was clearly kind of a wacky old guy who was just not credible.
I know, but as I later showed, and I debated both Randall and Frank Kaufman on ABC TV, and they lost. He's milked that cow until it's not going to come home again. And of course, it was predictable that he'd scramble and say, that Kaufman was a hoaxer only after he died, of course. But anyway, I'm glad you saw through that. And Art, you're here tonight to talk about a very different subject. We're not going to talk about UFOs and all that stuff, but let's talk about the election. First of all, can you give our listeners who don't know you and know your work and know your views a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from? Because we're so polarized today, unfortunately. I don't want people wrongly thinking you're a Trump supporter, a Trump hater, whatever. You call it as you see it. God bless
Yeah,
you for that.
here's the thing. I'm a contributing editor of the Washington Monthly, and we have a major article out this week today that I worked on called Donald Trump's favorite voting machines, ballot marking devices, and key swing states could give him the perfect excuse to contact the election. But here's the thing about the tradition of the monthly: although we're liberals and progressives, we're not hidebound or excessively ideological, and so we go where the facts lay. And I've done that through my whole career. So I don't pull my punches when it comes to looking at democratic functioning or parties or unions or even otherwise noble reform groups. Similarly, I don't pull my punches when it comes to corporations and the Republicans. I basically call out hypocrisy and dangerous actions, and I'm very, very opposed to ideological rigidity. Now, that may sound like, oh, that's just an abstraction, but it means that if you're ideologically rigid, you tend to ignore certain issues in favor of others. And
Yes.
I see all sides, and I go for where we have the most vulnerability. And that's what we're so right now, my piece is adding a new element, we hope, because it's being sent to a lot of, it's being retweeted and being paid attention to by mainstream journalists like James Fallows and Norm Ornstein. This article where we're looking at a vulnerability that is being ignored by and large by mainstream media outlets, all of the Democratic parties, with the exception of Ohio at the state and national level. And it's something new to worry about, and which is that they have these unverifiable voting machines that are what are called universal use. They're ballot marking devices, and they're throughout the state of Georgia, and they're in major Democratic strongholds, oddly enough, and I will explain why, in big cities in swing states. They're in Columbus, Ohio. They're in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They are in Dallas. They are in Austin. They are in Charlotte. How could this happen? What that means is they are voting machines, which, of course, you see voting machines in every polling place because they're required by law under disability rights and under different laws to have at least one or more disabled, accessible, independent voting machine. However, what's happened is a massive scam. Hundreds of millions of dollars were ladled on the just the top 2 to 3 uh, voting machine companies in the United States, and they pulled off a huge scam that is now so outrageous. And here's the key element of it: it's not so much Russian hacking and not so much that they will fail. Oh, they failed incredibly throughout this primary season. It's that there's no way to prove that the computer printouts are valid. You can't audit them, you can't use them for recounts, and you can't use it to verifiably and reliably declare a winner. And here's the other outrageous element: if you go in, 20% of the American voting public, if they show up, 20% of registered voters in this country, if they show up in polling places, they will have no other option except to vote on these unverifiable, hackable machines. And guess what? It's mostly Democrats, and mostly the failures of liberal reform groups that brought us here. That's not the case in Georgia, where it's a long-standing vote-suppressing state. People may have heard about the many different ways that Stacey Abrams couldn't win what was seemingly going to be a close but valid victory for governor in 2018. But the failure of major mainstream reform groups that are otherwise admirable. They include verified voting, the national branch of Common Cause. Some state common causes have taken a different position, like in New York State, but nationally, they've either actively supported this horrific, hackable, unverifiable machines or said nothing about it. And that it also verified voting, Common Cause, and the very prestigious NYU Brennan Center. These are all wonderful, normally wonderful civil rights groups, and they've been focusing on vote suppression, but they haven't paid much attention to this particular new type of machine. And this may sound so arcane. People have heard about voting machines. Oh, the lefties have been complaining about hackability for 20 years. Who cares? It's never been proven. These are the arguments you may hear. But in this case, it is going to be central. The president has made clear that he intends to challenge every which way, including Sunday, any result in which he loses. Any result. So, for instance, it's well known that if he wins on election day, he's doing everything possible to sabotage mail voting, and they had to have a court ruling to try to limit the Postmaster General DeJoy, who people, of course, know, literally went in and ripped out high-speed ballot scanners and probably just took axe and broke them apart and threw them in the trash, created new rules to slow down. The reports are pretty obvious that the slowdown has been about 20 to 25%, and to discredit mail-in voting, that is obviously necessary and is going to be about 3 times greater than they were in the presidential election in 2016 because of the pandemic. That is kind of well known. But now, unfortunately, through the abetting of Democrats at the state level and national level and major liberal reform groups who I otherwise admire and have previously interviewed, they allowed this voting machines of universal use to spread in these battleground states. And this is a danger because absolutely 100% you can hear it here, first. If Trump loses in any battleground state that I've mentioned, Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and Ohio, for starters, if he loses anywhere, he will claim the voting machines were rigged. And here's how an example of this that people should be shocked about. It's so screwed up, and I will explain the corruption and alleged corruption involved in this. The Democratic Secretary of State, who is the decision maker on elections, appointed by a Democratic governor, was actually in court last week or so, within the last week or so, on the same side as the Trump campaign, the RNC, and state Republicans fighting the NAACP of Pennsylvania to prevent voters in Philadelphia from having all their votes count. Now, how crazy is that?
That is crazy. We'll be back after the commercial break, and boy, have you opened a can of worms. We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the second segment here on Cal's Corner Radio Show on the X Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. The executive producer of the show is Rob McConnell. Boy, are we off to a fast start out the gate on the topic of this one here. Not knowing the full scope of what Art was going to talk about, even I'm surprised, and I've seen more than a few things in my short life. Anyway, before we continue here, what Art was talking about again is a real problem. In fact, I think maybe a way to describe it, partly accurately, I think Art's better at it, would be a ticking time bomb. This is a disaster.
Absolutely. It's an election time bomb that is, and another metaphor, adding kindling to a constitutional crisis that we will be facing.
Okay, Art, let me stop you there. What I want to do is ask you two questions, one of which, the second of which segues into pick up where you left off. First question is, you said they're well-intentioned, well-meaning, etc. First question is, how could they be so stupid? Secondly, what are they going to do now? And what start with the example of what you talked about, what you just saw, because that's horrifying. But please start with the first question. How could they be so stupid? It's like
it's a little complicated. Part of it starts with these groups have been fighting against paperless touchscreen machines that are also known as direct recording electronics, or DREs, for decades. Okay, and those came about in the wake of, after the hanging chads of Florida in 2000. There was something called the Help America Vote Act, and as a result, billions were spent on largely junky machines. And what happened was there was a lot of paperless touchscreen machines, and that was their focus nearly 20 years ago. These were bad. And they felt that it was appropriate to have paper ballots printed out from machines, and that was good enough. And it was based on a myth. And here's the myth that has been disproven in the last few years and definitively disproven last year, which is that people check these computer printed out ballots. And that was their big battle. We got to have paper ballots. But then they conflated, this is the outrageous part, they created an opening for mostly crooked or greedy voting machine industry to start selling these horrible machines as ballot marking devices, because the good guy groups, and I cite a 2018 report that was joined by Common Cause, Verified Voting, and the Brennan Center. Look them up. They're all the leaders, highly respected. Their advice to election officials was to make sure to have voter marked ballots, whether by computer or by hand. See, they created a false equivalence. Now, what's come out for the last few years, it's been known most people don't check their ballots, okay? It was only like a minority. Then last year, University of Michigan had an amazing study. They found when they did trial runs, if they changed the voting results of people who voted, 93% of the people didn't notice that their ballots had been changed, and only a minority even bothered to look. So you need to understand the entire superstructure of reform efforts for 20 years, and then a greedy voting machine industry, and there's only three leading companies, and they play a key role here. ES&S and Dominion are the two top. Electronic ES&S is their acronym. Anyway, those there's just three companies, and then Hart Intercivic. They dominate about 90% of the market. So two dominate 80%. They seized on this nonsensical, mythical claim of voter marked ballots to begin producing these machines. Now, ballot marking devices were originally intended validly as accessible for the people with disabilities, and to provide lots of alternative language options as required under different laws. That, if you have a certain portion of people who are speaking Spanish or Hmong or some language, then you need to have ballots in their language. Now, what happened is in Pennsylvania, but here's the point, is they began using these good guy groups claims that hand marked ballots were equivalent to computer printed as a justification to sell to all of these states, particularly that were being sued over the paperless machines that these same companies were producing. So they turned around and went, okay, you've been sued and a court has said you can't have paperless. Guess what? We have these wonderful ballot marking devices that produce a voter marked ballot marked by computer, just like all these wonderful liberal groups and the National Academy of Sciences says are perfect and wonderful. And they come forward, and the spending was outrageous. They were used in LA County at 300 million, Pennsylvania about 150 million, in just one city where there was loads of lobbying and secret corrupt campaign donations in Philadelphia, 29 million, one city, state of Georgia, 107 million. Massive lobbying. And in Pennsylvania, basically, in the article, we interview experts, Rich Gorella, an activist with Protect Our Vote Philly, who was leading the way locally, explained what was going on. You had a bunch of allegedly crooked Philadelphia political insiders who wanted to have riggable machines and to prevent people from being able to use hand marked paper ballots. And they pushed hard for this horrible system called Express Vote XL. And one of the justifications Democrats used was, oh, it's good for minorities. Yet the state's own review found that not a single disabled person could even see or verify any ballot cast on it. That's how badly designed it was. It was junk from the get-go. And then to top it all off, the Secretary of State, a nominal Democrat, Kathy Boockvar, has stood by it. She was sued last year by the National Election Defense Council and various groups, and a lot of this is being coordinated by a group called Free Speech for People. And you go to their website, which is freespeechforpeople.org, and you can see all their lawsuits. They're organizing most of the handful of lawsuits, and the other is the Coalition for Good Governance in Georgia. But in Philadelphia, what's happened is there's a new lawsuit filed by the NAACP for a broad range of relief for having safe and accessible elections. So the complaint alleges that there's an insufficient number of polling places. They're using too many of these repeat touch voting machines that include the BMDs, and limitations of voting and limited access to vote by mail. So guess what? This is, in theory, moderate Democrat has been opposing all of these reforms, and then it literally boggles the mind. The Democratic Secretary of State in a remote Zoom court hearings was joined by the intervening of the Donald Trump campaign, the RNC on the same side, fighting against the NAACP. And so if you take all of this together, and there's a lot of good reporting in Bloomberg and NPR and The Atlantic and The New Yorker about the role of corruption and trips and advisory groups and flying people to Las Vegas of the voting machine industry. If you add this whole mix together, they basically went all in on these horrible ballot marking devices that can't be challenged, and they can't be used. The results can't be challenged in court, and they can't be used to definitively proven that anybody has won. And then to top it off, groups like Verified Voting and the Brennan Center served as advisors in various capacities to the states that were rolling this out. And it was so outrageous that Verified Voting last year had its two top experts on computers quit their board and various advisory roles. And one of the most critical one of these people that I interviewed, Philip Stark, is the statistician who has designed the gold standard of auditing. It's called risk limiting audit. It's a way of using an algorithm for real sampling to see if the results. Now, here's the key point from the guy who created the system. He said to me, verified voting was duped and that they were giving their support. Now, some of these quotes, unfortunately, because of space reasons, aren't there, but I linked to his letter of resignation. I linked to articles about his stuff. So some of the original quotes in the early drafts are not there. But the key point is the state of Georgia and Pennsylvania were claiming that they were doing, the gold standard of auditing to determine the accuracy of the machines, okay, and the accuracy of the results. The guy who invented the system, it that's the guy. He says, no, those kind of computer printout ballots are not trustworthy, and you can't do valid risk limiting audits. And yet the state and these liberal groups are going along with it and saying, yes, these are great, wonderful risk limiting audits. And then to top it off, this will be in a follow-up piece, a guy named David Becker, who's a regular pundit on elections. He was an original champion of these universally used ballot marking devices. And then after became a champion of them, he was then hired as a consultant. And then after the debacle in June in Georgia, he was quoted in the New York Times praising them. And the New York Times didn't bother to mention that his organization was on the payroll of the state of Georgia as a consultant. And when I asked him about that, he said, well, it didn't raise our salaries because it was the organization that got the funding. And so there's no conflict of interest. It didn't personally benefit me since my salary didn't increase as a result of the contract with the state of Georgia. Okay? It's just that nutty. And I report about people who have been critical of him, that he's essentially, in my view, defamed, like an excellent person who is a must follow for your listeners, a woman named Jennifer Cohen. Her Twitter handle is Jenny Cohen, COHN #1. It's a must follow. Also, a person who follows these issues very closely is Brad Friedman, whose show I was on earlier today. It's called The Bradcast, and his Twitter handle is The Brad Blog. If you look at those two people, plus Marilyn Marks, one in Georgia, you'll see what is going on and yet, to this date, right now, after 2016 and the Russian elections, no matter what, our democracy is literally hanging by a thread. Even now, they're silent. It's unbelievable.
Well, we're going to take a break in a moment. We're not quite there yet, but real quickly, let's start on this train of thought here. First of all, do you think that most of the Democrats who are going to be impacted this are aware of what you're about to expose? And secondly, of the ones who are aware, why aren't they doing anything about it? Because let's say they had good intentions, wink, wink. It's suicidal. It makes no sense. It's like saying how to snatch, defeat from the jaws of victory.
Right. Okay. Here's the thing is, almost nobody in Democratic Party circles, with the exception of Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who's very vocal on this stuff, but he should be booking himself like every day on MSNBC to be screaming from the rooftops. And that's a critical point. I would say most Democrats are unaware, and here's why. They've had 20 years of since 2002, there's been an endless stream of propaganda. It turns out to be propaganda because these original liberal good guy groups wanted to stop paperless DREs, paperless touchscreens, that are now only used by 14% of the voting public. They're no longer in common use. And yet they were so eager to discredit them that they gave a pass to any machine that printed.
Welcome to the third segment here on Cal's Corner Radio on the X Zone Broadcast Network. Once again, my name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. This is Cal's Corner, and the executive producer of the show is Rob McConnell. Now, Art Levine was talking to us about a horrifying development which is now being exposed, especially before the American people. It is a horrifying development that basically proves that the integrity of the voting machines in key cities and, of course, key states, the fact that any of them out there are compromised is wrong, and he's going to get into more details there. We were talking about the question at the before the break of how many Democrats know about this, what is going to be done, and I want to make it clear here that the reason this is being exposed is not to help or play favorites in the election. Anytime you have any part of an election process, whether it's stupid voter ID laws one way or another, or lack of them, or whatever, the point is anytime the process is compromised, that is wrong in principle, and whether it's a machine hanging chads or aliens or Pleiadians, doesn't matter. There's a problem. It has to be fixed. Otherwise, democracy has no point if the elections don't have integrity. Okay, Art, continue from the point we talked about before the break, which is which senator in Oregon is doing something about it and what's going to be done going forward here, what needs to be.
Right. Well, here's the thing. Wyden has been, there's other people who agree with him and have signed on, but he's been the most vocally critical. Senator Ron Wyden is also a champion of vote by mail, and he's one of the first U.S. senators to be elected in a full vote by mail election. Now we, of course, have a lot of vote by mail problems, but he's identified the vulnerabilities in these voting machines, and he's insisted on having the option for people which is the majority practice in the United States. In 65% of the American voting public across the country can walk into a polling place and vote on a hand-marked paper ballot and put it into a scanning machine. Now, even if the scanning machine can be hacked, the point of it is, it may or may not be, you still have that verifiable hand-marked paper ballot. And that is how that paper ballot, it is why Senator Al Franken, in that massive recount on that super close election, he got in by like 258 votes, and it was accepted as valid because they recounted all of it and they had all those paper ballots that were hand marked.
Okay.
Now he is trying to act to, but Mitch McConnell hasn't allowed any election security or any election administration spending bills to be passed in the Senate because they'd rather see the election system melt down and possibly keep it open for Russian interference. That's why he's been called Moscow Mitch in various ways for his lobbying for industries that have Russian backing. Plus, he and others have failed to take action to there's other vulnerabilities, like there's modems attached to scanners. Now, the issue is, why are Democrats and most liberal groups, mainstream, high-profile liberal groups, so silent? And the reason is a misguided belief, because I have a Harris poll from 2018 that shows why this is wrong, and it's in the article. The misguided belief that if people are told that there's problems with the voting machines, they won't show up to vote at all. Intuitively, that makes sense, but it has the same, but the reality of it is when there's the risk of vote suppression, and this is why the critics of these machines call it electronic voter suppression. It's electronic voter suppression. It's different in kind, but not in impact of standard voter suppression, like wiping out people's names on voter purges, like over 1 million were purged in Georgia before the 2018 vote, or just having thugs, which are now permitted by the RNC. They had like a 38-year-old court order preventing ballot security off-duty cops from running around outside polling places. They had been barred from doing that. Now they're determined to have 50,000 people who are mostly going to be off-duty law enforcement. And in open carry states, if they're outside of the electioneering zone, they'll be able to carry guns outside of polling places. And the Democrats are doing nothing meaningful about it. They're hoping on courts. So what can be done? It's my view there's an excellent group called scrutineers.org that is trying to bring people together to network about it. But there's the existing groups that provide the most hope are the local chapters of an organization called Indivisible. Now, right now, they're focused on the Supreme Court fight, but they have very good organizing and some indivisible chapters, and they are aligned with another election integrity organization called Smart Elections. And they did a letter to Congress warning about these problems. And most Democrats were, not paying attention. So, Common Cause in some chapters. So, the concept is what can you as an individual do? First of all, there's an excellent printout by Jennifer Cohen at Jenny Cohen COH1, tips on mitigating problems in the voting system. Everybody should read that article. It's a very good handy summary. Things such as always ask for a hand-marked paper ballot. If you're going to be voting in person, you should bring out an already filled in sample ballot that you probably got in the mail so you know exactly and you don't slow things down. And because of the diciness of the vote by mail, then try to use drop boxes if your state has them. These are common sense suggestions, but they're and also if you see vote suppression in real time on election day, there's 8866 protect our vote. It's the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, and I interviewed the leader of that group as well. So there's a number of suggestions that hopefully it's the election protection hotline is 866-687-8683 or 866 our vote, and this is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And those are things that people can do on their own as an organization to lobby their counties. So it varies by state, but there's no good reason that a liberal area like Austin, come on, it's Austin. Why would Austin prevent people from having all their votes accurately counted? There's no good reason. However, I do think they can be pressured through groups like Indivisible.
Okay, Art, you mentioned a very interesting point here because when I think, as I recall, you were first on my show years ago when we were doing Cal's Corner from India, Daily World, on video, and we were talking about the election. And I predicted Trump was going to win, and I heard a bunch of just BS from fellow journalists saying, nah, it's going to be Hillary. Anyway, he won. Now,
I projected that he had a good chance of winning too, and I had a big long article in Huffington Post that appeared before any polls opened on election day.
I'm glad you did that, and I was unaware of it, and I'm glad you got it out there for the record. Now, going forward, I quit my coverage of this election after the pandemic broke because it made it irrelevant. But it seems to me you just hit on something that I don't understand, again, why they're so dumb about this. Wouldn't you agree that once Texas turns blue, it's over effectively, at least electoral college-wise, for any Republican going forward if he wants to run for president?
Yeah, if it turns blue, but you need to understand because of these voting machines that are unverifiable and in key Democratic urban areas that would allow Texas to turn blue. By the way, Nate Silver in 538 says the real linchpin state is Pennsylvania. Okay.
All right.
That's the linchpin state. Now, but here's the point is because of these existence of these quote universal use ballot marking devices, no option for optical scans, no hand marked paper ballots in very important Democratic leaning areas in these key states, that means if quote Biden turns Texas blue, it isn't going to be accepted by Trump and his minions and his lawyers.
Okay,
Okay?
hold on. Let's say that that happens because he already said even today, and of course it's predictable he's going to do it. Got to be a gangsta, right? Um,
Right.
he's going to say, I refuse to concede whatever. You know, if I were president, I'd say the election hasn't happened. Depending on the outcome, will determine my response. Next question, please. That's the way you handle it. I'm sorry. I am so disappointed as a human being in this clown for president. Uh, anyway, the thing is, he's going to contest because I believe he's going to launch his own reality TV channel. He's going to continue the Trump show until he
Right.
dies. And then, of
Right.
course, Don Jr. can't do squat because he's nowhere near as bad or corrupt as his father. His father broke the mold set by his father, Fred. So, you know, I mean, I canceled my own book exposing Trump only because the virus made it irrelevant. But real quickly, I concluded, as I explained to you the other night, there was justification to spy on him, not for every reason the other side said. They were also not clean. The Steele
Right.
dossier was never credible, sorry. But because of who Trump made a point to associate with, and the government knew this, spying on him, allowing him to get away with a bunch of stuff so they could go after bigger fish, money laundering, Russian oligarchs. My God, there's so much dirt in there that it's disheartening because these guys know where all of each other's bodies are buried.
Well, yeah. See, that is one of the things is there's two ways to look at Trump's increasingly unhinged behavior in the last few weeks, where he's getting more openly authoritarian literally every half hour. I mean, it's too many to. I don't know what he'll have said tonight, but it's clearly. But there's a new danger that I did. That this feeds into. He
Mhm.
basically is hell bent. He knows that if he doesn't get reelected, quote, reelected,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
will be prosecuted and go to prison. And his oligarchic buddies in Russia, I will use the framing, and I urge you all to listen to an excellent, if radical, podcast called Gaslit Nation, because they were very prescient. The co-hosts were predicting Trump's victory in 2015 and early 2016. They said he'd govern like an autocrat. And in early 2019, they were calling out the efforts to extort smears on Biden in Ukraine
Mhm.
months before the whistleblower. So if you want to know what's going to happen, read them. It's called Gaslit Nation. Excellent. So their point is there's either two ways to explain, there's many ways to explain it, but the completely unhinged behavior is he's acting so irresponsibly. He's acting as if he knows the fix is in, that the vote suppression techniques and the remaining, final quiver in his arrow, Russian election interference, hacking. In 2016, they probed all 50 state Russian hackers probed and sized up like safecrackers waiting for their big score all of the states, every single state's voter registration database. Now, increasingly, and they actually penetrated two to three of them, including Illinois. And there's a HBO documentary called Kill Chain that actually has an on the record hacker who was inside Alaska, not a swing state, but he's explaining exactly how he was in a position to alter stuff. So the Russian threat, a Belarus style attack, but here's the point: the Russians are extremely smart. They're not. They're not going to have like a Belarus type attack and all the internet goes down across the entire country and no voting machine works. They can just go in and start hacking if they want to. But the point is, if Trump loses any key state, he is going to be screaming rigged election. And then
Yep.
he's going to be fomenting. And there's a guy named Greg Palast who I think sometimes gets irresponsible. But he talked about, how things could end up delayed and get thrown into the House. And
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
and it's each state has one vote. It's not the Democrats have majority. And then how legally Trump could be elected. And he posited stuff that I hadn't even thought about. If he if remember Trump's liberate tweets, and he had armed people show up at the state house of the
Yeah.
Michigan governor? Well, he's going to do that for the election results. And
Welcome back to the fourth and final segment here on Cal's Corner Radio Show and the X Zone Broadcast Network. My name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. Our executive producer here is Rob McConnell, and our guest is Art Levine. Now, we were talking again about the election, the fact that there's some electronic voting machines, that are being set up in key swing cities and states. And what it means is, with no way to really handle these black box voting devices put in there by our representatives and their infinite wisdom and all the corruption that goes along with that, we now have a scenario that is impending, waiting for us, barring a miracle, it seems, where the election will be contested, and God knows what will happen then. So, Art, you brought up a point about a contested election. Let me tell you what people are saying, at least out on the West Coast here. And I'd like you to address this because you brought up a point that they're not saying, which is very important. If I believe social media and the right, even some Democrats, they're saying that if this election is contested, it'll go into the House and Nancy Pelosi will end up being Speaker of the House because that's the way it goes. They won't be able to figure out whatever. It's not that simple. Please clarify for everyone listening what the two likely scenarios would be if it ends up contested.
Well, it's a little complicated, but basically, apparently, under the 12th Amendment, if there's uncertainty, what can happen is, for instance, Republican governors and legislatures can certify one set of electors to go to the Electoral College, while let's say, Democrats who think they want to stay can try to certify another. But if it ends up in the House, where it will end up, the likelihood is Nancy Pelosi is not going to become the president. Is the House under the 12th Amendment is going to be able to vote in, because a majority of states are Republican. Okay, I know that's hard to believe, but which is just one vote per state, and every state is the same. California is the same as Utah. Okay, if a majority of the one vote per state for choosing, finalizing electors, that has to be it's a little complicated, but just type in 12th Amendment and look it up. But basically, it is likely to go to a, quote, legal choice of Trump. But secondly, even before it gets there, given if Trump has his crazy religious fundamentalist new, and it's a 6-3 court in place before November 3rd, or in the time of November 3rd, then he and Barr are going to be doing all sorts of trickery to charge. Let's say in key states, Biden lost the day of election, but it's a massive overvoting for Biden, legal overvoting, meaning a majority of people in the states are voting by mail for Biden. Well, they're going to try every trick possible, legal and extra legal, to stop that. And it'll be much worse than Florida 2000, where the recount was halted, if you recall, by the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
That provides a justification, because Barr is going to sue any like Pennsylvania. They'll look for trumped up examples, so-called, in problems in mail by voting, to sue and halt the voting as fraudulent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not counting fomenting his streets. Now, there's a very important report and article that people should look up. It's called the Transition Integrity Project. And there was a big article about it on the Outlook section, and Brad Friedman's broadcast interviewed one of the leaders of it. Here's what they concluded. It was 100 experts, journalists, political strategists, bipartisan. They concluded, outside of an overwhelming landslide on election night for Joe Biden, outside of that, every other option leads to a constitutional crisis and violence on the streets. Every other option. Now, let me read you from Rick Hazen. There's a new article in Slate. Very briefly, he says, with less than 6 weeks to go before Election Day and over 250 COVID related election lawsuits filed across 45 states, litigation strategy of the Trump and his allies try to block the expansion of mail-in balloting wherever possible, and in a few key states, create enough chaos in the system and legal and political uncertainty in the results that the Supreme Court, Congress, or Republican legislatures can throw the election to Trump if the outcome is at all close or in doubt. This is one of the country's leading experts who isn't paying attention to the issue I'm raising about the ballot marking devices. It's a Hail Mary, but in a close enough election, we can't count the possibility out. I've never been more worried about American democracy than I am right now. And he's not paying attention to the ballot marking device issue I'm raising in the new Washington Monthly article.
Okay. All right. Now, you've raised again another key important point here, which I think is probably going to take up the rest of the segment. Art, I can't thank you enough as a fellow American. I'm absolutely going to vote this time around as well. Or I didn't last time. I sat it out in protest because I refused to either standard. This time, I'll be honest, I'm going to vote for the Democrats, and I'll tell you why. I don't want Trump, but when I hear Kamala Harris tell me that she's for the people, I want to puke. I know better. I was born in the same city she was. But as far as I'm concerned, that's Oakland, by the way, the Democrats, they're promising so much now that if they don't deliver it, I don't think they have a future. I think the Republicans, due to demographics and a whole bunch of stuff they've self-inflicted, they don't have a future. But with record numbers of Americans being independents, wanting a viable third alternative, but not doing anything to get that third alternative, I'm going to ask you this question, Art. Let's say that this problem didn't exist. Let's say that the Democrats really do some good things and start to put this country on the track it should have been for a long time. It's not as simple as Trump. I wish it were. My question to you is this, and it's every American. Would you, if you agree that we are an oligarchy now, what difference does it make as far as political powers? It's a degree of pain, and it depends on the issue and cost.
It's fundamentally different. Here's the reason: is Trump is a full-throated autocrat, and I will agree with the analysis of the historians of tyranny and autocracy, such as Timothy Snyder, and the analysis of modern journalists like Sarah Kendzior. This is a international crime organization masquerading as a government. This is a full-throated autocracy under Trump. So no matter the weaknesses of Democrats, this is an existential threat to our democratic way of life. And if the Democrats get in and they don't deliver, they can be legally and properly voted out of office and they can be criticized. But if Trump gets to stay in, you have no idea. Well, yes, you do. If you look at other governments like from Hungary to Turkey and so on, you look at other autocratic governments and Putin's Russia that took over nominally democratic countries, that's what we will be facing.
Okay, I understand that. Okay, I understand that. But I'm going to come back to the point here because I'll tell you, the reason I left the Democratic Party, and this show isn't about my personal political things.
Sure.
But let's be honest here. We sold our future out to China, and there's one party that led that charge, and the other party, now both are feeding at that trough. So my question is, whether it's Silicon Valley oligarchs that control the Democratic Party, or whatever oligarch, Soros, Bill Gates, whatever, doesn't matter, or it's Trump and his Ukrainian or Russian buddies, they're all a handful of rich people, and the parties are corrupted by unlimited money because our Supreme Court in its infinite wisdom ruled that corporations are people too. So until that is fixed, how can anything be solved? Because I don't see how it can happen. I don't see how you get
Well,
from.
here's the thing is I happen to agree with you that the Democrats strayed from their traditional concerns about poverty and the working poor and and workers, and they basically over the decades got compromised by the legal profession in Silicon Valley. So they strayed away from it. And but we now but the income inequality that is driving so much of the thirst by the 40% of the American public for Trump. You got to remember, it's 40% of the public are going to vote for Trump,
Hmm.
probably. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
That's kind of horrifying with the 200,000 people dead. And, there's literally is nothing he can do that will prevent them. And it really is kind of like a death cult. The difference is that we have a shot at our country surviving and our institutions surviving. And I do think that there'll be a better opportunity to create the kind of equitable reforms that will deal with this kind of oligarch dominated societies that we're facing. But I do not think that Soros and Zuckerberg and the people from Silicon Valley pose the threat to American institutions, all told, in toto, and our democratic institutions in general, and voting that literally a criminal gang that is we forget the level of corruption and the violation of norms that have gone on in terms of him profiting off of his businesses. And
I
it's
I,
it's
I
there's
understand that.
they're not comparable.
I
And I do think that there's enough of a reform drive that if we have a legitimately elected government, and that the Democrats at least have a shot, there's a shot for reform within that's genuine. Right now, we have a shrinking minority of white Christians who want to run a government that is geared to the most extreme white Christians in the country. And it doesn't reflect the majority and the increasingly diverse population and attitudes of this totality of American citizens. And
you're right. You're right about that, Art. But I would also argue that when I hear that Mayor Bloomberg, in his infinite wisdom, is going to spend several $1 million so that prisoners can vote, gee, which way are they going to vote? He might as well be buying votes. I'm sorry, I have a problem with it.
I sort of like in that case, I'm like, we're in extreme circumstances, and it is. I think there's a legitimate case to be made that it is the equivalent of vote buying, but it's not exactly vote buying. And I do think that in this case, when literally democracy and the future is at stake, I remember early on in the article, I spoke to a reformer who's not quoted in the article named Harvey Wasserman, who has regular Zoom meetings that you type in and Solartopia, where people discuss the threats to the election. I said, what will happen if the reforms you're seeking don't happen? And he said, um, well, Trump is going to win if none of these reforms of election integrity take place, and he will be president for life. And I don't think that's it sounds horrifying when I spoke to him in February, but based on what we're seeing right now and his jokes about another third term because he was so the Russia investigation and the attacks on him in his first term were so unfair, he wants to have a third term. Okay. So you need to understand we're in totally uncharted waters, and unfortunately, our media has failed us because they are not capable of dealing with someone engaged in a blizzard of lies that is a part of the authoritarian playbook. Over 20,000 lies. So, like Hannah Arendt says in her book, are we allowed to curse here or we're not allowed to curse? Because Steve Bannon referred to it as a blizzard of S.T that goes on by flooding the zone with lies.
Yeah.
We create a thing where no truth can be known, and that is central to authoritarian victory, and our media isn't prepared to handle it. And that's where I'm trying to speak
Yeah.
out of an article in the Washington Monthly.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, Art. Thank you for joining us. We'll continue to be in touch, and we'll also provide updates on this. And you're on to something that all Americans in the world needs to know about. Thank you.